There is a game that almost no one talks about openly, yet so many people have felt it. It's subtle. It doesn't come with rules written down. There are no announcements, no confession, no clear start or finish. But if you've ever felt yourself slowly pulled into proving your worth to someone who keeps stepping back just when you step forward, then you felt it. And the truth is this: they wanted you to chase them so bad, not because they didn't care, not because they were indifferent, but because being chased feels safer to them than being chosen. Being pursued feels safer than being seen, and deep down, what looks like detachment is often just fear dressed up as control. At first, it doesn't look like a game. It looks like mystery. It looks like independence. It looks like someone who doesn't need much, who isn't clingy, who isn't dramatic. You admire that. You even respect it. They don't text too much. They don't reveal too much. They don't lean in too quickly. And when they do open up, it feels rare, almost sacred. You feel special. You feel selected. But what you don't see yet is that the distance is not accidental. The pauses are not random. The emotional unavailability isn't confusion. It's protection. It's strategy learned long ago. Because for someone wired this way, closeness feels dangerous. Vulnerability feels like exposure. And exposure feels like losing control. Control is everything to them. Not because they are evil. Not because they are calculating masterminds sitting somewhere planning your emotional response, but because their nervous system associates intimacy with overwhelm. When someone gets too close, their body doesn't register comfort. It registers threat. So what do? They create space, and when you feel that space, you naturally move forward. You ask questions. You try harder. You offer reassurance. You chase. And the moment you start chasing, something inside them relaxes, because now the power is balanced in a way that feels safe. You're the one leaning in. They're the one leaning back. They're not exposed. They're not vulnerable. They're being pursued. Being chased gives them validation without risk. It gives them proof they are wanted without requiring them to fully show up. It allows them to feel desired without having to risk rejection. And rejection is their deepest fear, even if they would never admit it. They act independent. They act self-sufficient. They act like they don't need anyone. But underneath that calm exterior is a fear that if someone truly sees them, sees their needs, their softness, their insecurities, they might decide it's too much. So instead of risking that, they flip the script. They make you prove yourself first. That's why being chased feels safer than being loved. Love requires mutual vulnerability. Love requires consistency. Love requires emotional availability. But chasing keeps them in control. If you're pursuing, they can always step back. If you're trying harder, they never have to question whether they're enough. Your effort becomes their reassurance. Your anxiety becomes their comfort. Your pursuit becomes their ego boost. And this is where the push-pull dynamic is born. They give you warmth, then they cool off. They lean in, then they disappear. They text deeply, then they go silent. And every time they pull away, your nervous system lights up. You feel the shift immediately. You replay conversations. You wonder what changed. You try to fix something that may not even be broken. And when they come back, even casually, the relief feels intense. That relief creates attachment. That unpredictability creates chemical spikes in your brain. It bonds you deeper, not because it's healthy, but because intermittent attention is addictive. They may not consciously think, "I want them to chase me," but their pattern reveals it. They are most comfortable when you are slightly off balance, when you are the one seeking clarity, when you are the one asking where this is going, when you are the one trying to close the emotional gap. Because as long as you're chasing, they don't have to confront their own fear of intimacy. And here's the part no one prepares them for. The moment you stop chasing, the moment you don't double text, the moment you don't ask for reassurance, the moment you don't fill the silence, the moment you lean back and choose yourself instead of trying to decode their mixed signals, that's when the script flips, and they feel it immediately. At first they think it's temporary. They assume you'll reach out. They assume you're just busy. They assume you'll miss them enough to break first, because that's how it's always worked before. But when the days pass and your energy remains steady, something shifts inside them. The comfort they felt from your pursuit starts to fade. The control they quietly relied on starts to slip, and what replaces it is confusion. Why aren't you chasing? Why aren't you reacting? Why aren't you trying to pull them closer? For someone who has always equated love with pursuit, your calm detachment feels like rejection. Not because you rejected them, but because they subconsciously believed your chasing was proof of their value. When that proof disappears, they are forced to sit with something they've been avoiding for years, their own insecurity. They won't show panic. They won't send paragraphs confessing fear. They might even act colder at first. Pride rises before vulnerability does. They tell themselves they don't care. They convince themselves you were never that important, but internally their nervous system is unsettled because the dynamic that felt safe is gone. When you stop chasing, you unknowingly remove the shield they've been hiding behind. They can no longer measure their worth through your effort. They can no longer rely on your anxiety to stabilize their distance. Now the space feels real. Now the silence feels heavy. Now the possibility of losing you feels permanent. And this is where many people misunderstand the avoidant pattern. They assume detachment means they don't feel anything. That's not true. Often they feel deeply, but later. Often they process loss after it's already happened. Often they only recognize the value of connection when the chase is no longer available. But here's the deeper truth. The reason your refusal to chase affects them so strongly is because it forces them to confront vulnerability from the other side. When you were pursuing, they had emotional leverage. Now they have uncertainty, and uncertainty is what they've been trying to avoid all along. You stepping back doesn't just remove your effort, it removes the illusion of control. It creates a mirror, and in that mirror, they see something uncomfortable. You are not desperate, you are not dependent, you are not waiting. You are grounded, you are regulated, you are secure enough to let go. And that is both attractive and terrifying to someone who relies on distance to feel safe, because secure energy doesn't beg, it doesn't pressure, it doesn't collapse into anxiety, it simply observes and chooses. And when you shift into that space, you unintentionally disrupt the entire dynamic. You're no longer participating in the push-pull dance. You're no longer feeding the cycle. You're no longer proving yourself. And suddenly, they have to decide, do they step forward or do they retreat deeper into avoidance? Some will test the waters. A casual message, a subtle reaction to your story, a light check-in that seems harmless. It's not always manipulation. Sometimes it's curiosity. Sometimes it's fear of losing access. Sometimes it's the ego quietly checking if the door is still open. But here's what matters most. You didn't stop chasing to make them panic. You stopped chasing because you realized love should not feel like auditioning for a role you already earned. You realized that if someone needs to be convinced of your value, they are not emotionally ready to hold it. And that realization changes you. Because the moment you stop chasing is the moment you reclaim your power. Not power over them, power over yourself, over your reactions, over your self-worth, over your need to be chosen. They wanted you to chase them so bad, because as long as you were chasing, they never had to face their own fear of being fully present. But when you didn't, when you held your ground, when you let silence speak louder than pursuit, you forced a different outcome. You exposed the truth that love is not about proving, the truth that consistency is not too much to ask, the truth that someone who only feels safe being pursued is not ready to stand beside you equally, and whether they come back or not becomes less important, because the real shift didn't happen in them, it happened in you. You stopped confusing distance with depth. You stopped romanticizing unpredictability. You stopped chasing someone who needed the chase more than they needed connection. And that is where this story truly begins. Because once you stop chasing, something else begins to unfold beneath the surface, something they never prepared for. At first they may try to act unaffected. They may post more. They may appear busier. They may subtly display independence, as if to communicate that your absence has changed nothing. But internally, there is a shift they cannot ignore. The dynamic they relied on is no longer predictable. The rhythm they controlled has been interrupted. They were prepared for your pursuit. They rehearsed it in their mind. They expected the follow-up message, the emotional clarification, the late-night confession. They had responses ready for when you would try again. But what they did not prepare for was your stillness, your grounded silence, your refusal to run after them. When the script flips, confusion settles in first. They replay interactions, they look for clues, they wonder if you found someone else, they question whether they miscalculated your attachment, because deep down, they believed you would always lean forward. They believed your desire for them would override your self-respect. But you didn't, and that unsettles them more than rejection ever could. Because rejection, they understand. Rejection is clean, it's final, it's something they can defend against. But indifference, emotional stability, quiet detachment, that's harder to categorize. That forces introspection. And introspection is uncomfortable for someone who survives by staying slightly disconnected from their own vulnerability. So they begin to experience something they rarely allow themselves to feel: insecurity. Not loud insecurity, not dramatic insecurity, but subtle, internal questioning. Am I losing them? Did I push too far? Did I misjudge their tolerance? And here's the irony. The very distance they used to maintain control now becomes the reason they feel unstable. Because your detachment feels like rejection to them, even if you never rejected them, even if you never criticized them, even if you simply chose peace. To someone who equates love with pursuit, your calm withdrawal registers as being unwanted, and underneath their avoidant exterior lies a wound they've carried quietly for years, the fear of not being chosen. They built walls to avoid being abandoned. They perfected independence to avoid needing anyone. They created distance to prevent heartbreak, but the core fear was always the same: what if I am not enough? When you stop chasing, that fear surfaces. They may never admit it. They may never articulate it, but internally they feel the shift in power. They are no longer the one being sought after. They are no longer the one holding emotional leverage. Now they are uncertain. Now they don't know where they stand. And uncertainty is terrifying when your entire attachment strategy is built on control. This is where the internal panic begins. Quiet, hidden, carefully masked. They might check your social media more than before. They might reread old messages. They might look for signs that you're thinking about them. Not because they suddenly became secure, but because the loss of your pursuit destabilizes their sense of significance. They relied on your effort more than they realized. Your messages reassured them. Your attempts at closeness confirmed their value. Your anxiety made them feel desired. And without that steady stream of validation, they have to sit alone with their thoughts. Alone with the possibility that maybe they underestimated you, maybe they assumed you would tolerate distance indefinitely, maybe they believed your love would outweigh your boundaries forever. But something changed in you, and they can feel it. They feel it in your tone, in your absence, in your refusal to over-explain, in your lack of emotional urgency, and it unsettles them because it signals something they did not anticipate. You are no longer operating from fear of losing them. You are operating from self-respect. That shift creates a silent power reversal, not a manipulative one, not a calculated one, but an energetic one. When you stop chasing, you regulate your nervous system. You stop reacting impulsively. You stop seeking reassurance from someone who cannot consistently provide it. And that stability becomes visible. And stability is confronting for someone who thrives in unpredictability. Because now they cannot provoke a reaction, they cannot trigger anxiety, they cannot rely on your emotional pursuit to confirm their importance. Your calmness exposes their inconsistency, your grounded presence highlights their avoidance. And when they feel that exposure, they often test the waters. It might start subtly, a simple message that appears casual, a reaction to something you posted, a light-hearted comment that reopens the line of communication without addressing anything substantial. They don't dive into vulnerability immediately. They don't confess fear. They don't suddenly become emotionally available. Instead, they hover. They want to see if the door is still open. They want to see if you'll lean forward again. They want to see if the dynamic can return to what it was, because part of them misses you, and part of them misses control, and sometimes even they don't know the difference. This is where many people get pulled back into the cycle, because when someone who once withdrew suddenly shows interest, it feels validating. It feels like proof that you mattered. It feels like victory. But the deeper question is this: are they interested in connection, or are they reacting to the loss of control? Missing you is not the same as missing the power they felt when you chased them. And this distinction is everything. When they sense that you are no longer waiting, scarcity kicks in. Scarcity triggers urgency, and urgency can look like renewed interest. But renewed interest is not the same as emotional growth. Sometimes they come back because they fear being replaced. Sometimes they come back because their ego was bruised. Sometimes they come back because they never thought you would walk away for real. But very rarely do they come back fully prepared to offer the consistency they once resisted. That's why you must stay grounded, because when someone who avoided closeness begins to show curiosity again, it can create hope, and hope is powerful, but hope without boundaries recreates the same cycle. The truth is, when an avoidant realizes you're not coming back in the way you used to, grief begins slowly, quietly, and often delayed. They may not feel it immediately. At first, pride protects them. At first, distraction numbs them. At first, they convince themselves they prefer independence, but time has a way of softening defenses. And when the silence stretches long enough, memories become louder. They remember your consistency. They remember your warmth. They remember the safety they felt in your presence, even if they couldn't fully receive it at the time. And sometimes, months later, it hits them. The realization that you were not asking for too much. You were asking for reciprocity. You were not trying to trap them. You were trying to build something stable. You were not chasing to control them. You were chasing because you cared. And that realization can be heavy. But here's the part that matters most for you. Their delayed clarity does not require your delayed boundaries. You don't have to reopen yourself just because they finally feel what you felt months ago. You don't have to resume pursuit just because they are now uncomfortable. Growth means you recognize the difference between someone awakening and someone reacting. Because when you chose not to chase, you did something profound. You interrupted a pattern that may have defined their relationships for years. You refused to participate in a dynamic built on imbalance. You refused to prove your worth through persistence. And in doing so, you transformed. You stopped romanticizing emotional distance. You stopped interpreting inconsistency as depth. You stopped confusing intensity with intimacy. You realized that love is not supposed to feel like anxiety mixed with hope. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. They wanted you to chase them so bad because chasing kept them safe. Chasing kept them in control. Chasing allowed them to feel desired without risking vulnerability. But you didn't. And now the real question is not whether they will come back. The real question is whether they are willing to step forward without being pursued. Because true connection requires mutual movement. It requires both people leaning in. It requires courage on both sides. And if they can only move when you chase, then they are still operating from fear. Your strength was not in making them panic. Your strength was in choosing peace over pursuit. Your power was not in withdrawing to manipulate. Your power was in withdrawing to protect your heart. And as this chapter continues, one truth becomes clearer with every passing day. The moment you stopped chasing was the moment you started attracting something healthier, something balanced, something real. And whether they rise to meet that or remain in their distance will reveal everything you need to know. And whether they rise to meet that or remain in their distance will reveal everything you need to know. Because eventually the illusion fades. Eventually, the moment arrives when they realize something deeper than ego has been touched. It wasn't just about control. It wasn't just about power. It wasn't just about the chase. It was about testing you. Not consciously, not maliciously, but subconsciously. They wanted to see how far you would go, how much you would tolerate, how much silence you would endure, how many mixed signals you would decode, how many emotional gaps you would bridge alone. Somewhere deep inside there was a quiet trial taking place, a measurement of your devotion, a weighing of your persistence, and you passed every test. You showed up, you reassured, you waited, you understood, you gave them space, you adjusted yourself to fit their comfort zone. And still, it was never quite enough. Because the test was never designed to end. The test was designed to confirm something inside them, that people always leave, or that people must prove their loyalty repeatedly to stay. And when you kept chasing, you unknowingly participated in that confirmation. You showed them you would keep trying, even when they pulled back. But when you stopped, the test failed. Not because you weren't worthy, but because you refused to keep auditioning for a role you had already embodied. And that is when something shifts inside them that they rarely talk about: insecurity. Not loud insecurity, not visible desperation, but a subtle, internal fear of being replaceable. Because if you can walk away calmly, then you must believe you can find better. If you can detach without chaos, then you must not be dependent. If you can choose yourself without punishing them, then maybe they were not as irreplaceable as they assumed. And that realization can shake someone who built their emotional safety on being pursued. They begin to question themselves. Was I too distant? Did I push too hard? Did I mistake their patience for weakness? Did I assume they would never leave? These questions don't always lead to growth. Sometimes they lead to defensiveness. Sometimes they lead to doubling down on avoidance. Sometimes they tell themselves you were too sensitive, too demanding, too emotional, anything to avoid confronting their own fear of closeness. But sometimes, and this is rare, they pause. Sometimes they sit in the discomfort long enough to see the pattern. They see how they lean back when someone leans in. They see how they feel safest when they are being chased. When they are being chased, they see how they confuse independence with isolation. And in that rare moment of awareness, they stand at a crossroads. One path leads deeper into avoidance, into repeating the same dynamic with someone new. The other path leads toward vulnerability, toward learning how to lean in without being pursued first. Growth requires humility. Growth requires admitting that the chase was not love. Growth requires acknowledging that someone walking away calmly was not a betrayal, it was a boundary. And not everyone is ready for that. Because secure energy does something confronting to someone who thrives in push-pull dynamics. It removes the dance, it removes the adrenaline, it removes the emotional roller coaster that once defined connection. It demands presence, it demands consistency, it demands emotional availability. And if they are used to intensity instead of intimacy, your calm stability can feel unfamiliar. You didn't become cold, you became regulated. You didn't become distant, you became grounded. You didn't withdraw to punish. You withdrew to protect your peace. And when secure energy stands firm, it exposes every unstable pattern around it. It makes inconsistency obvious. It makes avoidance visible. It makes emotional immaturity impossible to ignore. That's why, even after you stop chasing, they may feel drawn back to you. Not because they suddenly transformed overnight, but because your energy changed. You stopped reacting. You stopped proving. You stopped explaining yourself repeatedly. You stopped overextending, and that shift is magnetic. Because when someone who once chased you now stands still, it forces you to step forward if you want connection, and stepping forward requires vulnerability. So they hover, they observe, they test lightly, they send subtle signals to see if you will re-enter the old rhythm. But this time, you are different. You feel it in your body. You no longer experience the same panic when they delay responding. You no longer feel compelled to clarify every silence. You no longer interpret distance as a reflection of your worth. You see the pattern clearly now, and clarity changes everything. Because the truth is, they were drawn to your warmth from the beginning. They were drawn to your emotional depth. They were drawn to your consistency, but they also relied on it without reciprocating it fully. And when you stopped offering it freely without mutual effort, the imbalance became undeniable. This is where many people expect a grand gesture, a dramatic confession, a sudden transformation. But real life rarely looks like that. Sometimes the realization inside them is quiet. Sometimes it's slow. Sometimes it's incomplete. Sometimes they feel the loss, but don't know how to repair it. Sometimes they miss you, but are still afraid to move toward you without being chased. And this is where your strength matters most. Because the final truth of this entire dynamic is not about whether they chase you back, It's about understanding that you were never meant to chase in the first place. Love is not supposed to feel like convincing. Connection is not supposed to require performance. Consistency is not supposed to be rare. You were not asking for too much. You were asking the wrong person. And when you stop chasing someone who depends on pursuit to feel safe, you create space for something radically different: mutual desire, mutual effort, mutual vulnerability. They wanted you to chase them so bad because chasing allowed them to avoid confronting their fear of closeness. But you choosing not to chase forced a truth to the surface. Either they grow or they repeat. Either they lean in or they retreat. Either they learn to meet you without a power imbalance, or they lose access to the version of you that once overextended. And here is the part that matters most for your heart. You did not lose by walking away calmly. You did not fail by refusing to prove yourself endlessly. You did not give up too soon. You simply stopped betraying yourself to keep someone comfortable. And that is maturity. That is emotional evolution. That is self-respect. Because when someone only feels secure being pursued, they are not ready for partnership. They are ready for validation, and validation fades quickly without genuine intimacy. You deserve someone who moves toward you without needing to be chased. You deserve someone who feels safe choosing you openly. You deserve someone who doesn't confuse silence with strength. And whether they come back with growth in their hands or remain in their distance, you have already won something far greater. You won yourself back. You reclaimed your emotional energy. You stepped out of the cycle. And once you step out of that cycle, you never see it the same way again. The chase ends. The clarity begins. And from that clarity, something stronger is born. Not desperation, not pursuit, not anxiety, but quiet confidence. And quiet confidence is something no avoidant pattern can control. And quiet confidence is something no avoidant pattern can control. Because quiet confidence does not beg. It does not perform. It does not chase. It simply stands. And when you stand in that energy long enough, something extraordinary happens. The entire dynamic dissolves. Not because you forced it, not because you manipulated it, but because you outgrew it. There comes a moment, after the confusion, after the subtle hovering, after the ego checks and the quiet observations, when reality settles in for both of you. For them, the realization deepens. You are not coming back in the same way. You are not re-entering the old pattern. You are not stepping into the familiar role of pursuer, and that permanence changes everything. For you, something even more powerful unfolds. You begin to feel lighter. The mental loops stop replaying as often. The urge to check their activity fades. The emotional spikes lose intensity. What once felt urgent now feels distant. What once felt magnetic now feels optional. And in that space you finally see the full truth. They didn't want partnership. They wanted pursuit. They didn't want mutual vulnerability. They wanted reassurance without risk. They didn't want to stand beside you equally. They wanted to stand slightly ahead, being reached for. And once you see that clearly, you cannot unknow it. There may still be moments of softness, moments where you remember their laugh, their presence, the way it felt when things were good, and those memories are valid. They don't mean you imagined the connection. They don't mean it was fake. It simply means the connection existed within a dynamic that was unsustainable. Love cannot survive on imbalance. It cannot thrive on intermittent validation. It cannot grow in soil where one person is always leaning forward and the other is always stepping back. Eventually, the one who leans forward gets tired. And when you stop chasing, you didn't just disrupt them, you liberated yourself. Because the final layer of this journey is not about their reaction, it's about your transformation. You began this dynamic trying to win them over, trying to close the gap, trying to prove that consistency is not suffocating, trying to show that emotional presence is not a threat. But now, you understand something deeper. You understand that someone who fears intimacy will interpret your closeness as pressure. Someone who equates love with loss of independence will resist your stability. Someone who learned that vulnerability leads to pain will guard themselves even when you offer safety. And none of that is your responsibility to fix. You cannot heal someone by chasing them. You cannot prove your worth into someone's readiness. You cannot love someone into security. They must choose that work themselves. And sometimes this is the hardest truth. They won't. Sometimes they will repeat the pattern with someone new. Sometimes they will find another pursuer. Sometimes they will recreate the same push-pull dynamic because it feels familiar. Familiar feels safe, even when it hurts. But here is what changes the entire story. You will not be the same person in the next connection, because now you recognize the signs. You recognize inconsistency. You recognize emotional withholding disguised as mystery. You recognize the adrenaline rush of unpredictability, and you no longer mistake it for chemistry. You recognize the early signs of someone needing to be chased to feel valued. And this time, you won't step into that role. That is growth. That is healing. That is breaking a pattern, not just for them, but for yourself. Because let's be honest for a moment, there was a part of you that felt validated by the chase too. There was a part of you that believed if you could just love harder, show up better, be more patient, more understanding, more secure, you could finally unlock their consistency. You believed your effort could inspire their availability. And when they pulled back, it activated something inside you, a need to restore closeness, a need to bring balance, a need to secure reassurance. But now you see that dynamic clearly. You see that chasing was not proof of love, it was proof of fear. Fear of losing them, fear of not being enough, fear of abandonment. And when you stopped chasing, you didn't just challenge them, you healed something within yourself. You proved to yourself that you can survive distance. You proved to yourself that silence will not destroy you. You proved to yourself that your worth does not shrink when someone withdraws. And that realization is life-changing. Because once you detach from the need to be pursued or to pursue, you enter a new emotional territory, one built on choice, not compulsion, not anxiety, choice. You begin to ask different questions. Not, why are they pulling away? But does this dynamic align with what I deserve? Not, how can I make them feel safe? But do I feel safe here? Not, how do I win them back? But why was I trying so hard to win someone who wasn't fully showing up? And these questions shift your entire internal foundation. Because the ultimate truth is this: you were never meant to chase someone into loving you properly. You were never meant to prove your value repeatedly. You were never meant to shrink your needs to accommodate someone else's fear. And when you internalize that, something powerful stabilizes inside you. If they return, truly return, with awareness, accountability, and consistent effort, you will see it clearly. It won't be subtle hovering. It won't be breadcrumbing. It won't be ego-driven curiosity. It will be steady. It will be intentional. It will be mutual. And if they don't, you will not crumble. Because the version of you who needed to chase is no longer in control. The version of you who overextended is no longer running the show. The version of you who believed love had to be earned through persistence has evolved. Now you understand that real connection feels reciprocal. It feels safe. It feels consistent. It does not require decoding. It does not require guessing. It does not require you to abandon yourself to keep someone close. They wanted you to chase them so bad, because chasing made them feel powerful. But your refusal to chase made you powerful. And that is the ending that truly matters. Not whether they panic, not whether they circle back, not whether they finally understand what they lost, but whether you understand what you gained. You gained clarity, you gained boundaries, you gained emotional regulation, you gained self-respect. And once those are secured within you, no one can destabilize you with distance again. This is not about winning someone back. This is about winning yourself back. This is not about making them regret losing you. This is about realizing you were never meant to lose yourself in the first place. And as you move forward, you will notice something subtle but profound. You will no longer be attracted to people who need to be chased. You will no longer feel magnetized by inconsistency. You will no longer interpret unpredictability as depth. You will gravitate toward steadiness, toward reciprocity, toward someone who leans in when you lean in. And when that connection arrives, it will feel different, calmer, safer, balanced. Because the chase is gone, And what remains is something far more powerful, mutual presence. So if you are standing in that space right now, if you are resisting the urge to reach out, if you are choosing silence over pursuit, if you are honoring your boundaries even when your heart feels tender, know this, you are not losing them. You are finding yourself, and that is the kind of victory no push-pull dynamic can ever take away.